So welcome everyone. We are very fortunate today to have Elizabeth Catte with us. And I am going to introduce our two moderators, and then they will introduce Elizabeth, and Claire will introduce Elizabeth. So our two moderators today are Claire Clark, who is one of our secondary appointments, who has her primary appointment in behavioral science over in the med school, and who has worked on the history of addiction treatment. And our discussant will be Melanie Goen, who is, of course, in the history department, and she is the author of a book on medical care in Appalachia, and also very recently on the Kentucky women's fight for the vote. Go for it, Claire.
All right. With that, much of this is just what I have called about Liz from the internet. So here we go. Elizabeth Catte is a public historian and writer. She has a master's degree in American history and a PhD in public or applied history from Middle Tennessee State University. She's the author of What You Are Getting Wrong About Appalachia and Pure America, Eugenics and the Making of Modern America. And she's editor of 55 Strong, Inside the West Virginia Teachers Strike. And these are all from Belt Publishing. Her writing has appeared in The Guardian, The Washington Post, Guernica, The Nation, McSweeney's, and the Boston Review, among other popular platforms. Pure America has been described as provocative and impeccably argued by Publishers Weekly, and grounded, well-rendered, and highly disturbing by Kirkus. I discovered Catte's writing soon after the publication of What You Were Getting Wrong About Appalachia in 2018, and this was a book that made me, to quote the immortal words of some random guy on Goodreads, quote, "Want to quit my job and walk the earth with a knapsack full of copies and hand them out whenever I hear somebody mention hillbilly elegy," unquote. If that isn't applied history, I don't know what is. In addition to being a writer, Catte is an editor-at-large for West Virginia University Press and the founder of Passel, an applied history consulting firm. So welcome, Liz Catte.
Thank you. Thanks, guys.
Well, I have some questions that I want to pose, and then I want to make sure we leave plenty of time. We've got a lot of graduate students on the call, and so dishing out some career advice, I'm sure would be welcome for them. But I hope we can touch on a lot of different topics here. Your books, the subject of your research, public history and its applications, entrepreneurship, because I think you really, speak to using your training creatively. And so for a lot of us who are looking for jobs, for a life path, that could be valuable advice too. But let me start with your two books. They're small, but they're mighty. That's how I describe them. Some others have described them as spiky polemics, unsparing. I like what one reviewer said about your first book, a real ass kicker, to be a little irreverent there. And you've been compared to Howard Zinn. The one I would compare you to is Rebecca Skloot and her book on Henrietta Lacks, and sort of the tone, the way you incorporate your own story into the story of the past, the applications and the storytelling, all of that. That's to say, that's a very high compliment, because Rebecca Skloot, I think, speaks to so many people, my mother-in-law, my eighth grade son, the accessibility of it. So your books, I think, have a lot to offer us. I'd like to start though, how would you describe yourself? If you were maybe in just a word or a phrase, fill in the blank, I see myself first and foremost as.
I stick to public historian. I think I'm somebody who has a good degree of insecurity about the titles that I can claim for myself, because even though I'm a PhD, I don't work in the academy. I taught for a year or so, but I don't really consider myself an educator. But I think that I'm good with claiming the mantle of a public historian, because that is where the majority of my training falls. so I call myself a public historian. I call the work that I do applied history, and maybe it's interesting to talk about where the differences between public history and applied history are. But generally speaking, I think that is something that I do to distinguish the public history and public history training that takes place in the academy versus how it sometimes kind of is more practiced in outside the academy, in communities, doing local history and work like that. It's very, I like that the old schoolness of that term that kind of diffuses sort of like this mantle of expertise, and just sort of it presents itself as a very verby kind of history, the working history that everybody can kind of muck in and do. Anybody can apply historical knowledge in their lives, and sort of the strategies where they want to do work in the community. And that's why I like that label of applied history to describe the actual work that I do. But generally speaking, I'm a public historian. I generally just describe the kind of writing that I do as short nonfiction. And that also kind of gets back to that sort of like the little pressure point of insecurity that I feel about how to describe the kind of writing that I do. Is it history? Sure. Is it peer-reviewed history? Is it popular history? Is it research? Is it, I sort of like think differently about those kinds of questions every time that I'm asked them. So I think that, again, I go with what's safer, what's a little bit more universal, and think about what I actually produce in terms of writing as just nonfiction. And I also really enjoy writing short nonfiction as well. I think that that's a really kind of underloved genre of writing, the kind of work that people can read in a sitting or two. And I kind of draw a lot from my experience as a student when I write. I think selfishly, I write the kind of books that I wanted to read as a graduate student. So definitely on the shorter side. When you got your syllabus and there's a big seminar list of, 2 or 3 readings for each time, and they were books that could be anywhere from like 200 to 300 pages. That can add up a lot. And I knew that the most interesting parts were always engaging, like sitting down and engaging with others about text. So I want to go ahead and get people to that stage as quickly as possible. So I keep things on the short side, and kind of emphatically also want to show sort of historical processes at work in my writing. So even if people can disagree with my conclusions or outlook or opinion, they can at least see a little bit of where I come from when I write the things that I write, and kind of put things together the way that I put them together.
Did you always want to be a historian?
No, I didn't. I didn't want to be a historian at all. I have so I went to undergraduate and did a degree in Latin. And did another degree in classical studies, and I wanted to be a translator. And there were no jobs doing that. And I got into graduate school, and I don't even remember the institution now, but I did get into graduate school in the classics, but they forgot to send the acceptance letters out that year. And so by the time that I contacted the department, I wrote them a really mean kind of email, and I was like, I paid like $90 for you all to review my application. Could you at least send me a rejection or something, or acknowledge the application? And they're like, oh my gosh, we have not sent out like this entire batch. It wasn't everybody, but it was a significant batch of applicants. We never advised them of their status. And I was like, well, what do I do? And they're like, well, you can come, but we've given out all the funding for this year. And I was like, what do I do? And it just so happened that my university had the later application deadline. Like their application deadline was a month. I still had a month. So I applied, and I was accepted. And it was like 3 hours from my house, so it was a very doable kind of move. It wasn't you didn't have to reorient your entire life to kind of get to this school. Could go up there and pick out an apartment on a weekend kind of thing. And so I was like, well, I guess I have to do this. But, and that makes me sound kind of like a slimy, advantageous person, but I fell in love with the kind of history that my professors were teaching from day one, being brought into that seminar room, and sort of going back to I thought I would be very much out of my depth, but we started with these very provocative, but also very basic questions about what is history, what are the uses of history in everyday life. We were reading sort of like stuff from the 1930s, and where there was a great deal of energy for applied history and cultural history and intellectual history all kind of coming together, where history from the bottom, where history from the bottom up kind of becomes a valid framework for understanding the past. And so that was the world that I was immersed in from day one, where we left a lot of assumptions about what the past even is at the door and just kind of came together to discuss this story that is not so much about facts and figures and people, but about power. And I've never lost the enthusiasm for looking at history in that way. And I carry that with me when I'm doing history today, even though I'm doing it in a much different context. And that was really important to me. I studied with a woman named Rebecca Conard at MTSU. She was one of the founders of the modern kind of field of public history, and really had wonderful ideas about entrepreneurship and sort of like the role of the historian. And it helped a lot too that when I did public history, it was a field that had a lot of transparency about what the academy was, who it was set up to work best for. We kind of talked a lot about the fact that a lot of the people in this specific program, were women doing history, and are we doing sort of a lesser version of history? Are we relegated to this side of history because of that, and because we've had different experiences? Some of us were older, some of us were returning professionals, so there are lots of people with different kinds of life experience in those classrooms too, and that made a big difference to the way that our fellowship progressed, and the way that we were able to kind of ask questions of each other about what we wanted to do.
Well, let's talk a little bit, you're training in a public history program. Our department, we offer more traditional history PhD, but in your work and the kind of settings you find yourself in now, I imagine you're working with a lot of people that have the more traditional training. Are there things from your public history background that you see as particularly valuable? I mean, things that even maybe more traditional programs would want to incorporate in thinking about setting up future historians for success. What is it about public history that you see can be valuable?
I think that in public history, you get to know the business side of history a little bit better. And certainly I don't think we go far enough within public history. We need much, much more of that. But we have a bit more room to acknowledge things that I think have a great deal of bearing. So for example, who is going to pay for all of this work that we need to do within the community? So it's, why is it much easier to get, in states like Tennessee, where I trained, why is it much more, why is it easier to get funding to do Civil War projects versus projects that are about Black history? So there is that kind of acknowledgement of those dynamics within our field. We talked about ways to be subversive within our field, to kind of work within those different kinds of dynamics without losing sight of what we were trying to do, how to kind of pitch projects and pitch types of work to different funders. We always talked about, the kind of the tensions that can happen when you have a really great project, but you have, for example, if you work at a museum and you have obstructive board members, things like that. We talked about the different kinds of historians that one can be, whether it be an academic historian, a consulting historian, somebody that might work in an organization, not as a historian, but certainly draws upon their historical knowledge to do their job. Examples might be people who work at higher levels in kind of financial institutions, who do draw on history skills for things like to understand better problem solving, to do kind of make arguments and do things like that. So I think that in terms of setting up for, all the, many possibilities that you can take career-wise, we waded into those waters a little bit more. certainly also there was a lot of emphasis on things like public relations and marketing and how people can get a start in those kind of avenues, especially if we're working in organizations like nonprofits or museums or public facing history sites. But I do think that it's advantageous to go a lot farther than that in this, in this time, and to talk transparently about things like money, when to, even things that we don't like to talk about when to call it a day, when to try to do something else. And those were really helpful. We weren't ever the plan B. And I think that's a big deal. When I would go to kind of more traditional history spaces, it was like, well, if you can't get a job, you can go work in a museum. And that's not a realistic kind of way to think about any sort of job. Even people who were training to do this kind of work had a very hard time on the job market. So just having that space where what we were doing was very intentional. We had strategies to take things as far as we could go. We had strategies to kind of back off when we needed to back off. I never felt like I was doing something that if I didn't succeed at it on the first try or second try, that I had to kind of give up my professional identity. And that was really important.
So you finished your PhD in 2016, and you just alluded to the fact that hard to get a job, I mean, and we have
definitely
a lot of current students who are looking to the future and thinking about a pretty dismal job market. Talk about your first steps, maybe things that went well, things that didn't, moments that you hit where you thought, okay, this is the beginning. This is gonna turn things around and get me on the right path.
So I had a really, really miserable time on the job market, in the sense that I for the academic jobs that I was applying for, I was always like the number 2 candidate. I was always the person who got to the very end and then was not ever offered the job. And so I stuck with that for one major cycle and kind of dipped my toe in the water the following year and it was going in sort of a similar direction. And in the meanwhile, my partner, Josh, was one of the people who did land a job. And he was also not having a great time in his first year as a assistant professor. He was brought in to sort of build a public history program from scratch at a small university in Texas. So a university that really hadn't dabbled much in public history since, but kind of saw the wind was blowing in terms of getting some money to kind of diversify the humanities tracks at schools, and he was brought on to kind of strategize with that. And it wasn't great, primarily because we had to go where the job market sent us, and that happened to be at a part of Texas where we didn't have any family, we didn't have any friends. Environmentally, it was in sort of oil country, and we were not having a great time adjusting to kind of the differences in the environment. So we had these moments where we're like, is this even worth it? And to kind of put a line under it, I think our combined income that year was probably about $60,000 for both of us. So it's not like we were even making, a robust wage to kind of make all these sacrifices to do. And so what I did was I had all this sort of like media infrastructure in place from when I was a graduate student. They tell you at my program, they at least did, start a personal website for yourself where you've got a CV, someone, contact information, maybe some samples of your writing, and sort of like these, accounts like that. And I just started using them to write really angry things about books like Hillbilly Elegy, and some of the coverage that was coming out of the 2016 election. So this was about summer of 2016. And so I just turned all these kind of like professional accounts that I had made into sites where I was just very angry about everything that was going wrong with me personally and with the country as well. And they started getting picked up by different larger platforms. Like, for example, WordPress started featuring my website on its homepage, and Medium kind of the platform Medium came and worked out a deal with me to kind of get on their platform as well, people started writing to me saying, well, could you write something like this for our publication? And so that's sort of how that built from there. And eventually my publisher, Ann Trubeck, who works at Belt Publishing, said, you know, do you think that you could take some of this material and make it into a very short book, this sort of critique of hillbilly elegy and sort of like the Appalachian political phenomenon and writing genre that's happening as well, because she had kind of, you know, sympathy and solidarity for that as somebody who was living in the Rust Belt, that gets sort of like the same kind of coverage attached to it, especially in these like, you know, really, really frayed political moments. And so I said I would try my best. And I did. And that book became What You're Getting Wrong about Appalachia. And my partner eventually decided to quit his job after the first year. And we had created this sort of like fake company called, well, it was fake at the time, Passel. So, because you know, when you like apply to go to conferences and stuff, you always have to list your institutional affiliation and things like that. So that's a really awkward question when you are an unemployed historian or independent, even an independent, you know, they tell you to call yourself an independent scholar, and that's kind of like awkward as well for some people. So we just made up this like company called Passel. They're like, oh yeah, so that's our affiliation. But it actually started to generate business. Because we made like a very nice website for it, and we were doing, and you know, we talked about the work that we would love to do, and eventually my partner Josh got a contract, was brought on as a contractor for the National Park Service to do some historical reports for them, and did, and that was work for the National Capital Region, which is in this part of the world where I live now, Central Virginia. And so we were able to kind of put enough temporary contracts in place to kind of pad a return to where we're from. And that's really how our lives have progressed for the last 3 years. I do mostly writing. My partner, Josh, eventually moved back into working for libraries and archives, which he had some training in. And we do work as independent contractors. Primarily the primary client is the National Park Service, doing things like cultural landscape reports and sort of all the kind of work that they don't really have adequate staffing to do, sort of things like administrative histories, which only get done every so many years. So we're quite happy doing that. And we do some community work as well. We do that pro bono, and that's how we landed. We just sort of like tried to create little opportunities for ourselves to make ourselves feel better and to stay connected to what the kind of work that we wanted to do, work that we didn't have the opportunity to do in our current employment situations. And eventually staying at it, it created some actual sort of sustainable job opportunities for us to do. And it's been, you know, it's been really interesting to kind of compare where I sort of was when I first graduated, which was in a very kind of miserable, deflated place, with where I am now, which is still miserable because we're in a pandemic and everything is, you know, kind of changing around us, but it's certainly a bit more stable.
So the work you do for the University of West Virginia Press, is that contract work? Or?
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
It's still contract work. I am an editor at large, which I don't even kind of understand what that really is, but it's in sort of like common language, it's an acquisitions editor, and I do that contract. Mm-hmm.
Okay. So you are a testament to the idea that you can create opportunities. I imagine it's not easy to cobble together a living, but finding worthwhile work, living in a place you want to work, worth the sacrifices, I'm guessing.
Yes, for us, yes, definitely. We live in a part of the world. We had to be, you know, a little bit savvy with where we wanted to live within the kind of region that we wanted to make it back to. So we live in a part of Virginia where the cost of living is a bit lower. We still have access to Washington, D.C., which is important for the work we do for the Park Service, not only for, you know, its offices, but also access to the National Archives and Library of Congress. So we have, you know, we're within about 2 hours of the Capitol. if we need to be, and that really helps a lot. And meanwhile, we live in kind of a small city. There's about 24,000 people here. But it helps us keep our kind of our expenses really, really, really low. And kind of the good thing about what we do is there's no there's no overhead for writing historical reports. There's no we don't have to have professional insurance. We don't have to have separate set of offices. We don't have to kind of hire anybody to assist us. We don't have any crazy expenses in terms of operational expenses for the consulting side with what we do. So any money that we make, we can, after taxes, it's straight income, and that really helps a lot.
Let's talk for a minute about your books. And I imagine there's a lot of people on this call that haven't read your work. Can we somehow, I'm trying to figure out a way to give them a taste of that, whet their appetites, so they'll want to go home and read. And I think, in looking at the two books, and I read them close to one around the same time as each other, so I could see the linkages. And you mentioned power being a theme, the way power is claimed and reinforced and sort of flows through society over the span of time. And so I wonder if you can maybe tell us a story, give us an example from either of the books. I was particularly captivated by the eugenics book and the stories you tell in there, because, all of us, I imagine, on this call are familiar with eugenics, sure, maybe in a sterile kind of way, no pun intended there, but a way that we, sort of a textbook knowledge of it. Can you maybe share a story that helps us understand what eugenics means and meant to people, and the cruel ways it was used?
So when I wrote Pure America, it's a book with a very specific geographic focus, which is I live in the Shenandoah Valley, Central Virginia, and I didn't want to expand the boundaries of where I was writing about too broadly, because if you read the book, or sort of kind of read a description of the book, it's sort of anchored to a specific state hospital, which happens to be in my backyard here in Stanton. But fortunately, I could tell a lot of rich stories about the movement, the eugenics movement broadly, because one of the central figures in that history, a young woman named Carrie Buck, who lived in Charlottesville, is also on my doorstep. And I think that I was really surprised how few people knew about Carrie Buck when I started to write this book. She's from, like I said, Charlottesville, which is a community about 30 miles away from me, right on the doorstep. There's a small plaque about her life in Charlottesville. I certainly knew about her, but studying eugenics, because the Supreme Court case, Buck v. Bell, that nationalized eugenic sterilization nationwide is named after her. And so I assumed that people would have at least sort of that kind of knowledge, but really, I think that her life is still very unknown, and I think that that's kind of a shame. So I wanted to talk about her, but also in the book talk about what life was like after her sterilization, because that's something that's really kind of hard to capture. We tend to we know a little bit about what happens in these state hospitals. Again, medical records and medical privacy occlude a lot of facts. But after these individuals are released from state hospitals, at least in Virginia, it becomes much, much harder to track them. And so I wanted to at least kind of talk about Carrie Buck's afterlife, to kind of show what Virginia eugenics was really about in terms of controlling the lives of people, poor and vulnerable people. And so one of the most kind of chilling stories, and I don't even think I wrote about this in the book, although it stayed with me, is so Carrie Buck was sterilized in 1927. She would have been about 21 years old. The Supreme Court case is settled in 1924. She's sterilized in 1927, and within a couple of weeks, preparations are made for her to move out of the institution where she was living, which was called the Lynchburg Colony for Epileptics and Feeble-Minded. Institutions like that in Virginia operated a system called parole, which was similar in a lot of ways to the kind of parole that a formerly incarcerated person might enter into. They were sent out into the community but under strict terms of supervision. So they were told where to live, where to work. They could be recalled to the institution if their behavior didn't satisfy the people who were surveilling them, which in this case was the superintendent of the hospital. So Carrie Buck was paroled about 2 weeks after her operation, which was a hysterectomy. She was sent to work at a lumber mill. She is a domestic worker to the family that owned the lumber mill, operated the lumber mill. She was not a satisfactory worker according to their terms, and she was sent back to the institution. During that period, a family about 3 hours away happened to be writing to the state hospital saying, you know, we're in need of a domestic housekeeper. Can you send us a good girl from your institution? And so the terms of that arrangement would have been the worker was paid about $5 a month and provided with room and board, and then would provide full-time work for that family. And that arrangement was a little bit more long-lasting, I think about 6 years, until Carrie married, and that new change in status kind of triggered her emancipation from the institution. And so a couple of years after that, the superintendent for the hospital, who's a man named John Bell, wrote to Carrie, and they were in constant contact because Carrie's mother was also institutionalized. Carrie's mother was not sterilized. She was beyond childbearing age by that point, but she was confined for life because she'd been diagnosed as a moron, which is a type of person typically confined for life. And so Carrie was in contact with the institution even after she was released to kind of keep track of her mother's health and wellness. And so she gets a letter from John Bell, the superintendent, and he says, "Great news, Carrie. Somebody wants to write a book about me. And of course, you're going to be featured in it because you're my biggest claim to fame." You know, obviously I'm paraphrasing here. But he says, it would be really, really wonderful if you could send me a portrait of you so I can include it in this book that I'm writing about how great it was that I was able to sterilize you and make your life better. Oh, and by the way, if you happen to have a picture of the baby that we took from you, because Carrie Buck was institutionalized right after she gave birth to a daughter named Vivian, who was the product of a sexual assault. If you have a picture of Vivian, that would be great too, because then we can have a family picture. And so I just think about the kind of like the toxic power dynamics in that arrangement, the casualness of that letter, the fact that this is still about 1931 or 1932 in Virginia, and Carrie's in a rural part of Virginia. So where is she even going to go to get her portrait made? How is she going to pay to get a portrait made? She's been making $5 a month as a housekeeper in sort of this very coercive employment situation. How, you know, just sort of like the layers to that, and how abusive that kind of power was, and how unfeeling that power was. And then sort of the postscript to that is that Carrie did eventually send him a portrait, and she sent him her wedding picture. And so I don't know how to really interpret that, but I enjoy that I can be open to the possibility that that was intentional, and that Carrie understood what John Bell was asking her to do, and the way that John Bell was continuing to try to degrade her, and tried to interrupt that as best she could by sending this photograph that interpreted her and viewed her in a completely different way. And so I try to put stories like that, you know, in my writing. They're not exactly profound, but I think that they're very meaningful. These sort of micro readings of daily situations that people had to endure when they were placed under this kind of surveillance and that kind of power.
I really enjoyed how you imagine, you kind of look between the lines, and you may not have sources that suggest there's an intention in sending her wedding photo, but the way you read events to think about how people are subverting power, I think you just really creatively think about these situations and lend some emotional power to them. So I appreciated that. And one thing you do in certainly the eugenics book, but also the book on Appalachia, where you're taking J.D. Vance to task, you you do not let people off the hook. You hold them accountable, and you state, I think I'm paraphrasing, but you make no apologies for holding people in the past by the yardstick of the present. And that's a little bit of a change. I know I've written biography before. You're dealing with people who still have descendants or attachments, and so your way of trying to situate people within the era in which they're operating, and well, yes, they're racist, but look at all the humanitarian work they did. We tend to make excuses, and you're very blunt that you're not going to do that. What has been the response, I guess? Have you found yourself in hot water at any moments, or have people called you on that and said that they find that
yeah, so to answer that question, maybe let me talk about why it is that I decided to kind of take that approach. First of all, I think that I have, obviously the kind of historical writing that I do, I have a little bit more freedom to do it because I'm not writing research, I'm not writing, strictly scholarship. So I do like to take advantage of sort of like the freedoms that allows. And of course, there's kind of trade-offs for that. Not one is not better than the other. It's just a different kind of context. But I finished, my last year of my PhD was 2015 and 2016. So my sort of emergence into the world of a professional historian happened just as communities across the country were grappling with the death of 9 worshipers at Mother Emanuel Church in Charleston. It seemed like no matter where I went, I had friends, and certainly I was involved in these sort of like orchestrated reckonings with things like Confederate monuments or honorifics to the Confederate past. And there was one at my university, and I was involved in it, and I approached it very naively. I thought that this was like the opportunity to make real change at our university. And what it ended up being was just sort of like an arena for kind of that. It was an arena for, in my case, community members to come and yell at students, and particularly Black students, about how they didn't understand anything about their own communities. They didn't understand history, and it was terrible. It was a terrible and traumatic thing to experience as a bystander. And as I thought more about that process and process kind of what all the many things that went wrong, the thing that kind of kept sticking in my mind was that it really irritated me in sort of a superficial way that some of the community members that were very enamored with Confederate history, that had romanticized it to an unhealthy degree, they didn't even want to take a shred of that kind of plausible deniability that these community processes offered, to say, what, maybe I haven't thought about this, haven't thought about this enough. So it was these fraught moments of trying really hard to get some sort of accountability from these people in the community, to sort of like listen and to kind of understand a different point of view. These sort of like primarily older white people in the community, and that left such an impression on me that I think that, and also I can share that within public history, at the time, there was a big emphasis on sort of like sharing authority, and this idea that the best kind of history is collaborative, and it comes from the historian sharing the power with the community and making meaning together. And so I was very disenchanted with everything about these ideas that had kind of like come into my professional life. It's such a kind of crucial moment for me. And so I decided that if I was ever, when I decided not ever to do that ever again, not to kind of give that plausible deniability to anybody and watch them turn around and sort of not even consider it. And so I think that what I try to do instead is, I think any historian would say the context is the most important part of that understanding, that there's certainly ways that we can talk about who people are in their own time through context and nuance and understanding. We can say that, you know, certain people in the past thought that their actions were humanitarian, but, you know, we can kind of have longer conversations about whether or not they were. And certainly the eugenicists that I write about in Pure America, which are ones that are local to me, so I have an understanding about how they're remembered and their legacies are interpreted locally, do get that flawed humanitarian treatment. And I just wanted to short circuit that and say, I don't agree. You know, I think that these people were uniformly bad people. I think that they enjoyed hurting people. I have evidence that suggests that they enjoyed hurting people. You're welcome to a different interpretation of their words and deeds, but this is mine, and I'm going to proceed in laying the stories out in such a way. And then again, it's not a lens that kind of like is totalizing on these work. I'm not going back and saying like, aha, this is what I was talking about. This is them being a bad person. But I do think it's better to kind of get that, to be blunt about that, because that is how I think about these people. I don't think that there's much about them that is redeeming. And certainly there are, like, you know, not everybody is that uncomplicated. It just happened to be that some of the people in my orbit that I've written about in the past, like Nathan Bedford Forrest or Joseph DeJarnett, who's sort of leader of the eugenics movement, I think that they are bad people, and I don't really mind going on record saying that. It certainly kind of interrupts people asking me those sorts of questions that sometimes happen when you're talking for public audiences, like, don't you think that, you know, but kind of ... So at the very least, it means that people ask me those kind of questions less frequently. Nobody really, I mean, writing for the public is always kind of fraught. People do contact me and tell me that I'm wrong about things, but not in any sort of way that's made me doubt my approach to writing. Certainly, I think the most common sort of thing that happens is people ignore my work completely. And that's something that is really interesting, kind of happening locally too. So I wrote a book. I live in a community that's again 24,000 people. It's small. You know, everyone in town who's anybody has, like, you know, the Google alerts set about you know, important things in town, the business district, you know, our big hotels, the city in general. And so writing a book that says, you know, these kind of people who are from the city, very, very you know, did some really, really terrible things that aren't really talked about enough locally. And sort of the response to that is to double down and definitely not talk about it locally. So that's the primary response that I can tell when I've made people mad, is that they just ignore me completely. And that's true of JD Vance too. Everyone always wants to know if, like, I have interactions with him, and I have met him, but broadly speaking, you know, anyone that's on that side just ignores me, and I kind of ignore them in a day-to-day interactive way, and that's how we proceed.
Well, I want to make sure others have a chance to ask questions. I have more if people don't, but let's open it up. And what do other people want to know?
Well, I have a question. Hi, thanks so much for your presentation. Learned so much, really interested in the work that you and your partner Josh have done with the parks. My wife is a park ranger, and
oh, excellent.
We're at a historical site in Chicago, so very aware of how much is supported by the Park Service. But I want to ask you a question that follows up on the point about Rebecca Skloot's book on Henrietta Lacks, or the Vance book, which is, to what extent have you thought about pursuing writing projects that lend themselves into becoming films? So, you know, films are an important platform, I think, also for doing good historical work. And of course, you get paid. So
yeah. Yeah, that's an interesting question. I don't, the question, I guess the answer is I think about it in the sense that I know that that is the ultimate achievement for people like me who don't have kind of like routine day-to-day job stability, but certainly kind of have reoccurring project turnover, that one day they'll have a project that will really captivate the public. And I think, isn't it true that the 1619 project is going to be some kind of a feature, maybe not a film, but a series or something like that. And I know that HBO also just released some kind of docuseries about sort of a history in the trio kind of version about how we make meaning out of the past. So those are very interesting things to know that are happening. I don't ever see that happening to me because I'm not savvy enough to pull that off. I don't have an agent that I work with, primarily because I'm kind of like stacked with book contracts into the foreseeable future, and people, it's more advantageous to kind of make those arrangements when you have an unattached project working on. But it's such a different world for me, and I don't know if my heart could take it, because even though I am write for popular audiences, I am really bothered when people kind of misinterpret things that I've written, or get, kind of in repeating something that I've written about, get important facts wrong. And so those kinds of things I don't know if I would be able to digest insofar as a project. The liberties that are often taken, and some of them are completely benign and harmless, but the part of me that still functions fully as a historian wonders what I would how I would react to kind of experiencing that myself. But yeah, it does seem kind of like a big frontier for all of history in general. From I was talking to somebody the other day about how do we kind of work alongside of people getting their history from TikTok and sort of these kind of like kind of brief social media bites and things like that. And that's just not where my skills are, but I think it's fascinating, and I'll be interested to see again, like what happens with the 1619 project, and how that kind of makes the jump from collaborative project especially to kind of a documentary work.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
So thanks, Liz. I'm Phil Harling, and I'm a faculty member in history and the current chair of the department. And I'm really interested in your evolution from dissertating to writing what you've written subsequent to that, and how you would see the relationship between the two. Because I often feel as a teacher that we can make dissertating pretty joyless and pretty, and like we can kind of like lead students away from good storytelling. And that's something that I find troubling, and like the opposite of what we should be doing. And I'm not saying that's your experience, but I'm interested to hear your experience.
When I graduated, I put the longest embargo possible on my dissertation. So I don't ever want it to see the light of day. I hope, I know I don't have a choice in that, thanks to ProQuest, but it's one of those things where it was a great exercise, but the scholarship is probably very weak. Well, I did a very chaotic dissertation. And I think it was good that I was allowed to do that. But in terms of something that I'd want to look back on and say like, oh, that's great scholarship, not so much. So I did a dissertation about the public memory of racial violence in America. So not anything very on the surface, not anything that has to do with anything that I'm writing now for the public. But I looked at communities where there had been significant racial violence, what we would probably get abbreviated as shorthand as race riots. And I looked at sort of moments in those communities where community members, and specifically Black community members and descendant communities, had tried to demand accountability. So for example, I wrote about Tulsa, I wrote about Rosewood, and I looked at the memory of those events, and particularly if that memory was sort of changing over time, if descendant communities were able to kind of get control of those memories and kind of make them more accurate, and if those memories were useful to claiming things like reparations. And so it was, it's a disjointed dissertation that, there's something here, there's something here, there's something here. I wrote about, the military too. So anybody that kind of tries to dip their toe into military history knows that it's almost a completely different world. But I think that, and I passed, and it had interesting things about it. And I was able to kind of connect with somebody who was doing some work about one of the more understudied events that I wrote about. And I gave all my dissertation research to her, and she lives on Guam. One of my events happened in Guam. And so that went to like Guam PBS, and they made a little documentary about it. And she was able to kind of run with that and kind of put a lot more effort into it and to make it something that made a lot of sense and was an important community story to revisit. But I think that it was good that I was kind of allowed to do a dissertation that centered things like memory and power and sort of change in narratives over time, because that really influenced the way that I write. I write a lot about the role of memory. I write a lot about identity and narrative and sort of looking at the stories people tell about the past as an arena where power struggles get worked out. And that was true of my dissertation, not as smoothly as it certainly would have been if I had written it, today perhaps, but it carries over into my short history books as well, where I'm really, really interested in sort of things like local identity, power struggles in the past and how they manifest in the present, and ideas about who we are and things of that nature. So there's the commonality there. I think that I was really glad that I was given that freedom to write like that. I think that there's a debate to have about whether public historians should even write dissertations. Sometimes there's people have brought forward alternatives that are like major projects and things like that, and I don't really have a big opinion about that. But I can say that even as a public historian, I was glad that I wrote a dissertation, and I was glad that I was given the support to kind of write it a little bit more creatively, kind of centering these stories in sort of a big narrative. I like to write a sort of like a scaffold type approach where I build stories and build stories and build stories and build stories until finally, towards the end, the picture emerge. And that's a little bit indulgent for academic writing and dissertation writing. But as a writer who writes for the public, it's served me well to have the practice.
You said that you have some other projects in the pipeline. Could you tell us about what you're writing about?
I haven't. So I have. I'm due for a third book, and I really don't know what that's going to be about, because I have I have brain fog, like a lot of people do. I feel my brain kind of slowly coming back to life, but I don't. I'm very nostalgic for being a student where I can just get a syllabus and sort of see all these books and sort of suggestions for topics and sort of like kind of have that cushion to figuring out what's next, because I think I need a little help kind of jumpstarting that process. So I don't know what it will be. I'd like to write something about the Federal Writers Project someday. That's a little bit research heavy, and I don't know what it will look like when we start getting back to archives. So just as a practical concern, I'm not sure if topics like that will work. I'm doing, my partner and I, Josh, have had some kind of long-term projects going on that are about to kind of conclude, that we're very happy that they're able to be finalized. One we have been, and specifically my partner Josh has been working over the community in the Allegheny Mountains in Virginia to memorialize a park called Green Pastures, which was an African-American recreation site controlled by the U.S. Forest Service that has a really unique history. And so we've been working, and he's been working with the Forest Service to put that on the National Register of Historic Places and to get that taken care of. There's a lot of CCC architecture too. And finally, long story, but we were able to kind of organize a land swap between, kind of city and government entities, which is kind of a pain, but there are possible. So that is something that will be completed this year. And also we've been doing, and I've been doing a little work with a place called the Appalachian African American Cultural Center in Pennington, Virginia, kind of doing some work with a historical structure that they control, which is a small schoolhouse, and sort of saying that process to put that on the National Register of Historic Places. So we have these little projects that are coming to fruition. They're very community centric. And then in terms of writing projects, it's sort of up in the air. There's so many things that I'd like to research, but I don't know if that's going to be possible. And so we'll just have to see. But I do have I am on the hook for one more book for my publisher. So there'll be something in a couple, and in the next 2 years.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Well, I'll ask you this question because I know how labor intensive research and writing is, and you've written 2 books in 5 years, and you've been doing other things. So how the heck do you be so productive? Are there any secrets that you can offer us, or?
I don't feel productive at all. In fact, I feel underproductive. And I think that's because I guess I just don't know. Because I do have long periods where I don't do much of anything except sort of like think about projects and then handle kind of like the bureaucratic stuff that comes along with sort of operating your life as a business, which is kind of getting in touch with people to make arrangements and put projects in motion. I think that short fiction is the key. Is the key. I think it's like, I am somebody who, I was in school for, I went all the way through the PhD. And one of the reasons that I think I stayed in school so long is because I liked the kind of the fresh start that you got. Every semester was a chance to do something good and great and start over in some way and kind of do different projects and be, kind of reinvent things about your intellectual life. And so I kind of, even though I don't have that structure anymore, I do kind of try to stick with that ethos, because for me, it was very healthy in terms of kind of keeping my mind interested. So I do try to do, like to do one project and then do something completely different. Well, not completely different, but something in a different genre. And that helps keep things kind of turning over a little bit better. And so that's how I sort of structure my time, is just sort of do bite-sized projects and have them be a little bit different each time, so you don't feel like, and also that's a really good, I find that that's important for not, oversaturating myself. I have this, kind of particular brand of criticism where I say, hey, you're the person who's responsible for determining ideas about Appalachia, for example. It would be very hypocritical for me to kind of keep positioning myself as sort of this, a similar spokesperson, but, just sort of like the leftist or more progressive version of that. So I want to try to do different things to avoid kind of those conflicts, and to keep that little bit of detachment, so that I'm not overwhelming one particular arena. And that's difficult to negotiate in some contexts, but I think that it's important for me to do as well.
Jillian?
Hi. Yes, thank you. I wanted to ask where you see the field of Appalachian studies or history going now in this kind of hopefully post J.D. Vance era. What new and exciting things or new areas do you think people are getting into?
That's a good question. So I'm a little bit detached from this question too, because I don't consider myself an Appalachian historian. And I think that the reason that I don't consider myself an Appalachian historian maybe has some bearing on this too. But when the moments in time in the past as a student, when I would try to get into Appalachian history, I don't want to say it was unwelcoming or anything like that, but it was definitely a place that was undeniably a white space. It felt like a space that was a bit of an older space too. And even though there was this commitment to recognizing the various activist sides of Appalachian history, that looked a lot different when you were somebody coming to things like departments and conferences that were kind of very plugged into the academic side of Appalachian studies. So what I've been really excited recently to see is work like Jesse Wilkerson's work on women in Appalachia and in labor history. And I think that I don't want to sound indelicate, but I think that a changing of the guard, you know, might be something that is really needed in Appalachian studies. It's just my personal opinion and my personal experience on this. But when I've tried to re-engage with Appalachian studies as someone who has finally kind of written something that had some impact on Appalachian studies, it still felt like there was, you know, a lot of gatekeeping happening, and that and the same kind of, you know, 3 or 4 names and scholars kept popping up. So, you know, I'm excited to see what happens when you know, a broader changeover happens. And I know that, you know, in terms of working for the University of West Virginia and the press there, and the things that I get really excited to see when they sort of come through the press as potentials or as signed projects, or things that are about women, about Black Appalachians, and about Indigenous Appalachians, and the ways that there's a fusion of outlooks going on. So labor history and then women's history kind of coming together in those arenas. And I think that what would be really good too is if we could sort of, like, I know that technology is always kind of a wild card to talk about when we're talking about Appalachia, but perhaps some of the kind of changes to the way that we've been interacting with each other during the pandemic will have a positive impact on Appalachian studies too, and get people, you know, collaborating a little bit better. I don't know, Jillian, what do you think, as somebody who is about to enter into the field more broadly, and that you've written kind of already you know, written things for the public about this?
Well, yeah, before I came to UK, I got to write for the Lexington Herald Leader, which I'm grateful for that, write some op-eds, but I don't know, Carson's on the line. He's been in the field a lot longer than me. So, and he's way closer to finishing. I don't know if he wants to chime in here, because I feel like
Please.
I've already spoken a little bit. Are you there, Carson?
I guess we'll go ahead on to.
Yeah.
Carson says that he has no microphone.
Oh, that's okay. That's okay. And I'm sorry. I apologize for putting people up on the spot, but it's just such at some point, I when I answer questions like that, I do have to acknowledge that, unfortunately, to you know, a certain extent, for better or worse, I have been kind of responsible in some ways, or share some responsibility for kind of like this very annoying thing that kind of happens in Appalachian studies every so often, where we're just writing against bad ideas. And that's one of the reasons why I wanted to actually kind of take a little break from writing about Appalachia, is because I did sort of, you know, in processing that, wanted to kind of acknowledge that this is not the only way to write about Appalachia, this critical lens where we're just sort of pushing back and pushing back and pushing back. That certainly you need like a hand to build up and a hand to tear down, and you know, I don't, you know, when I wrote that book, I didn't have both of those hands available. I just, you know, wanted to tear down a little bit, and that's okay, but it's certainly not the entire, you know, it's not it's a perspective that has its limits. And so it's important to kind of, you know, listen as well, and see people who are kind of building up what they want as well.
So I had a question about how you develop relationships and work with your publisher. I mean, so I just got finished working with an academic publisher on my first book, and I was fairly amazed throughout the process how hands-off it can kind of be, and how the justification for that is basically, well, your book's not going to make any money, and so, you know, this is all we have to vote to you. So there's the peer review process, but there's not this kind of developmental stuff that you kind of imagine. And so I'm curious to know, you know, how your publishing relationships might differ from that, whether it be with the book publisher or with the other outlets that you've worked with.
So I will say that it was such a fresh air moment when I started to work with a commercial publisher. I didn't have to edit my own work for a start. I didn't have to format my own work. I didn't have to kind of, you know, set my own work in you know, a style guide, for example. And all of those things are just like, when you know that you don't have to do those, it just frees up your, you know, something in your mind to kind of, and you also feel a little bit more taken care of, I think, too. And I get what you say when you kind of say it's very off-putting, the way that some of the publications, or some presses kind of handle academic writing. Certainly the work that I do with the West Virginia University Press, I try to be a little bit more hands-on, but generally speaking, what I like to do is ask people, how do you like to be worked with? Do you want deadlines? Do you want an editor that will nag you? Do you want like conversations about feedback? Do you want notes about feedback? And so working according to the writer's preferences is always like the best thing that you can do. But I do agree that I think that part of the hands-offness can be this idea that the scholarship will be so narrowly kind of utilized in some respects, and doesn't have that kind of that same kind of profit flow attached to it, that it is sort of like, yeah, more unpaid labor. And so I don't have that, you know, I have the exact opposite of that relationship with my publisher. You know, we kind of understand each other and how we like to work. And I usually write, I like to produce a draft of something kind of left to my own devices. And then once I produce something that's you know, a reasonable draft, then I'm welcome to all kinds of feedback, and we do extensive feedback. So for Pure America, for example, it's not a peer-reviewed work, but it had a very good editor who also did light fact checking and things like that. And then it had an outside reader who was a specialist in disability history to give some feedback there. And then it had just a normal kind of copy editor as well, and who would catch other things too. And so, and then it was read by a board, the press's board. And so all of those kind of levels of attention and touch to the book, I think, are really important to me. You certainly don't want to kind of, I think it's very scary to produce a book that basically 2 people in the world have read, and then have it out in the world, and then just kind of have to wait for everybody to review it and weigh in on it. So the more attention to the work before it gets produced, the better. And that's certainly a difference between trade publishing and commercial publishing and academic publishing. But I think what I would say also is that, you know, I don't mean to be heretical to the press that I work for too, but, you know, trade publishing is open to people of an academic bent too. I know that there's weight to academic publishers and their systems of tenure and review that kind of need to be taken into account. But you know, I really enjoyed working with a commercial trade publisher. It's sort of like they have a good feel for working with sort of, you know, academics or former academics or people who basically have a book or an idea or a topic or research, and it's not really going to develop into, you know, a weighty kind of piece of scholarship. It's a bit more than like a journal article. It's something that maybe is a little bit timely, and so there's, you know, those kinds of projects and are a really good fit for the kinds of publishers that I write for too. There's places like Made by History with the Washington Post, and lots of different kinds of sections to publications and newspapers that like to feature work by historians too. And those are becoming very, very popular. Unfortunately, sometimes they don't pay for work either, which is something that people have to watch out for. I'm kind of the philosophy that you should always be paid, you know, something for your time and efforts. And I know that's it's a big topic in terms of academic labor, but there's alternatives out there. It's important to keep in mind.
Could I just ask, you know,
Yeah, please.
do you write a proposal per book? I mean, you said that you have a third book that you don't know what it's about, right? So how does that work?
So I've never written I don't have proposals, no. I I just kind of, of course I have to tell them what the idea is and we kind of flesh it out um, a little bit, but in terms of like writing something that actually looks like a book proposal that you would submit, where I say like this book is going to be X number of words, it's going to have 6 blah 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 chapters. This is like the description of it in sort of a chapter by chapter. I don't do that. I'm not saying that. So trade publishing does also require that from time to time, and particularly for new authors. But it just happened that we sort of just hashed it out by email for my first book, and then we kept going in that vein for my second projects. And on the business side of it, when I signed the contract for my second book, there's a convention called first refusal in publishing that sometimes says, you will give us like a chance to acquire your second book, or come to us first with your second book. And so I was, I signed on to that arrangement with my publisher, and so I don't really have to go through the proposal process with them. But of course, when I have an idea, I'll raise it with my publisher, and she'll tell me if it's good or bad, if it sounds terrible. I even wrote her an email the other day and was like, I don't know what to, she said, would you feel like working on your third book? And I said, I my brain's not working. What do you think I should write about? Like, I don't know. Should I write something commercial, maybe more commercial? Should I keep doing history? I don't want to write about Appalachia right now. What do you think will work for the market? And we'll have conversations like that. And I think that is, and I think that, I mean, depending on academic publishers too, and the press, I know that the press that I write for, work for, WVU Press, is very kind of open to having conversations. Like, I have an idea about this. You don't necessarily always have to kind of go into an introduction with a publisher or anybody that you might like to work with a full proposal hashed out. People are, generally in my world, very happy to give you some feedback and talk to you about your ideas without those kind of formal elements in place. And to what extent those will be necessary down the road is something that should come up in the conversation, depending on what's going to work on the other side too.
Thanks, that's really interesting.
So I'm really interested in other people's writerly practice. So I'm kind of interested in yours. And there's this one question that I think all of us struggle with in our different ways, and that is, when do I start writing? When do I stop reading and researching, and when do I actually start writing? And I'm just curious about how you might go about answering that perpetual.
Well, yeah, all my projects have deadlines. So I start writing when I think that I'll need to be finished in time to meet my deadline. So how it worked for the last book is I did about a year's worth of research, and then I wrote for about, I'd say 4 months, and then it took about 3 to 4 months to work with all the different kinds of editors that are brought in to spiff up a book before it goes to print. But for the Appalachia book, I just sat down in a closet and wrote it, and it took about 3 months. And I didn't really, because I had a little bit of background already, and I wasn't writing something that was research driven. It was more of a critique and opinion and things like that. That didn't take long at all. So I think that my philosophy is I write when I've reached the point that I can't turn, that I will miss my deadlines if I put it off any further. It always takes me a really long time to get started. And I always I'm somebody who struggles with the kind of the blank page, and especially kind of like the opening paragraph. And I do end up throughout the editing process almost completely rewriting my book, which is again another reason why it helps to write short nonfiction. It's easier to rewrite 40,000 words than 80,000 words, obviously. So that's the kind of writer I am. I'll start writing, early with the understanding that I will rewrite and rewrite and rewrite. and that, yeah, rewriting is really, really important to me. So even though I say that, I'm getting started on something, I know that it will be a while before the kind of the final version appears. And even the final version that I produce sometimes looks a lot different once other people become involved and help me kind of flesh out some things that had been giving me the kind of usual problems during the writing process.
Can I ask, among your list of publications is McSweeney's. And
Yeah.
I actually tried to look for your McSweeney's piece, but I didn't manage to Google it properly and couldn't find it
It's
earlier.
okay. It's a drawing, so it doesn't really like appear in Google stuff. So McSweeney's did a project. I mean, I just kind of mentioned that because it's funny. McSweeney's did a project which is that had authors draw various charts that represent what people in America are thinking about, what's on the mind of most Americans, and sort of versions of that. So I had a little drawing contribution for McSweeney's.
That's fun. Thank you.
Well, Liz, reading your two books, I just imagine that all you have to do is drive around and maybe take a different route to work, and you'll see something and you'll be inspired, because it seems like throughout your books, a lot of it is what you're viewing around you. And it's like you're wearing these glasses where you see the built environment and are able to, almost like an artist sees a light, you see something more than an old hospital or a national park. And so I kind of imagine, just drive around and you'll find your next book inspiration right there.
Yeah, possibly. I really enjoy writing about the environment and the built environment. That's kind of the work that I did for my master's degree. And also, I really, I think it's fair that whatever I write, I have some kind of connection to it. So I wrote about my region, I wrote about my community. I think that gives my work just a bit more integrity. So that's sort of the trade-off. Even though I can't always produce like robustly researched archival kind of sourced works about a community, I can write things that they're really, really meaningful to me, and they're meaningful for me because they're part of my everyday life. And that's exactly how I pick them. I kind of drive around and sort of kind of take stock about the feelings that I have when I'm kind of going about my community and these things that I can't let go, such as kind of Pure America, and even the Appalachia book. That makes my job a lot easier when there's something that kind of gets into my heart that just sort of I can't stop thinking about it.
Yeah. I highly recommend the Pure America book, and especially the latter parts of the book where you're talking about the reuse of the hospital,
Mm-hmm.
and the struggles over what do we do with these old sites that come with baggage. And I just thought it was really insightful what you talk about, and your point that you weren't going to go crash a wedding held at the resort now that occupies this old hospital that was doing these sterilizations, but you see it as moving forward with a knowledge of what went on and making sure that story is told.
Yeah, that was the diplomatic version of my sort of call to arms at the book. I would say that never in a million years is anybody that has sort of that makes money from that site is ever going to acknowledge my perspective on that, or the perspectives that people like me have. Today, in fact, my blood pressure shot up because I opened the local newspaper, and there's going to be a summer concert series at the former hospital, and sort of kind of like things like that happening, continuously happening when there's so many opportunities to just kind of dive into that history a little bit more. And I think that I really put a lot of effort into that book, trying to present a version of eugenics that wasn't necessarily, do you know what I mean? Not necessarily morbid or sort of like persistently dark. Wanted to talk about the way that it's reshaped, the environment around us, and sort of, to be in sympathy with people who find just it physically, traumatic to kind of perpetually visit stories about things like sterilization and sort of the cruel treatments that are often involved in early mental health, to talk about some things about the site that are important, but not necessarily so traumatic to think about, such as patient labor and things like that. So I think that it's interesting to open that window and sort of wait to see if somebody will kind of wave at me from the other side of that on the people who kind of control the new identity of the hospital. And I'm convinced that it will never happen in a million years. Never, never, never. So, and that's an interesting part of the story too, though.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, I thought that's what really, I mean, it kind of grounded it. It brought it back full circle. And I think maybe that's where the comparison with Rebecca Skloot and the kind of work she's done, there's where I saw some tie-in. Any other questions that anyone has? I think, we're getting near on the end here.
Well, I'm sorry, go ahead.
Go ahead, Karen.
I was gonna, if our one last call for questions. If not, I'll go ahead and tell us about next week's workshop. Okay. All right. So first of all, let me thank Liz Catte for really a stimulating and a really interesting presentation. It's lovely to to get inside the work of a writer and hear about all the different things. So thank you very much for sharing with us your personal stories about your historical studies and where they've led you. So thank you very much. I appreciate it. We all appreciate it. And the next workshop is in 2 weeks, and it will be Eladio Bobadilla, and the discussant will be Cristina Alcalde. And so join us back here in 2 weeks. And thank you, everybody, for coming. And thanks especially to Liz Catte, and thanks to Melanie Goen and Claire Clark, who in absentia, for creating this stimulating discussion.